The morning sun cast long shadows across the training ground at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. Admiral Marcus Hawk Harrison stood perfectly still, his weathered hands resting at his sides. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that only comes from decades of the most dangerous missions imaginable. Around him, 30 of the Navy's most elite snipers had gathered. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the best of the best, handpicked from SEAL teams across the country. Each man had proven himself in combat zones from Afghanistan to Syria. Their records spoke of impossible shots taken under extreme pressure, of lives saved and missions accomplished against all odds. But today, they were here to learn from a legend. "Gentlemen," Admiral Harrison's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "I know what you're thinking. You've heard the stories. You've seen the classified reports. Some of you probably think they're exaggerated." A few of the younger SEALs exchanged glances. The stories about Admiral Harrison were almost too incredible to believe. They said he once took out 6 enemy combatants with 6 shots in under 4 seconds. They said he could hit a target the size of a quarter from 800 yards away. They said he never missed. "I can see the doubt in your eyes," Harrison continued, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's good. Doubt keeps you sharp. Doubt keeps you alive." He walked slowly along the line of assembled men, his steel-gray eyes taking in each face. These were warriors who had seen death and dealt it out in equal measure. They were not easily impressed. But there was something about Harrison's presence that commanded absolute attention. "Today, I'm not here to tell you stories," he said, stopping in front of a young lieutenant who couldn't have been more than 25. "I'm here to show you what's possible when training, instinct, and pure will come together." The lieutenant, whose name tape read Davidson, swallowed hard. He had completed 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. He had 47 confirmed kills to his name. But standing before Admiral Harrison, he felt like a rookie all over again. "Lieutenant Davidson," Harrison said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "How many confirmed kills do you have?" 47, sir," Davidson replied, his voice steady despite the intimidation he felt. "Impressive," Harrison nodded. "And what's the most targets you've ever engaged in a single encounter?" Davidson thought for a moment. 4, sir. Taliban fighters attempting to overrun our forward operating base. Time frame? Approximately 20 seconds, sir." Harrison nodded again, then turned to address the entire group. 20 seconds for 4 targets. That's good work, Lieutenant. Combat-tested, battle-proven accuracy under extreme stress. The other SEALs murmured their agreement. They all knew how difficult it was to maintain accuracy when bullets were flying, and lives hung in the balance. Davidson's record was nothing to scoff at. "But what if I told you," Harrison continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "that sometimes 20 seconds is 19 seconds too long?" The training ground fell silent. Even the California breeze seemed to hold its breath. "What if I told you that in my last active mission, Operation Neptune's Arrow in Syria, I faced a situation where 6 hostile targets had weapons trained on a busload of American civilians, including women and children?" The SEALs leaned in unconsciously. This was the first time any of them had heard Admiral Harrison speak about his legendary final mission. "What if I told you that I had exactly 1.8 seconds before those targets would open fire and turn that bus into a massacre?" Harrison's eyes grew distant, as if he was seeing that Syrian street again, feeling the weight of 37 innocent lives in his hands. 6 targets, 6 different positions, 6 angles of fire, all with clear shots at the bus. He paused, letting the impossibility of the situation sink in. "And I had 1 rifle, 1 magazine, and less than 2 seconds to save them all." The silence was absolute now. These were men who understood the mathematics of death, who knew exactly how impossible what Harrison was describing really was. "Some of you are doing the math in your heads right now," Harrison said, that slight smile returning. 6 targets in under 2 seconds. That's 3 shots per second minimum. And that's assuming perfect accuracy, no adjustment time between targets, and 0 room for error. Lieutenant Davidson found himself shaking his head slightly. It was physically impossible. The human body simply couldn't move that fast while maintaining the precision required for accurate long-range shooting. "I can see you don't believe it," Harrison said, looking directly at Davidson. "And why should you? Everything you've been taught, Everything you know about the limitations of human performance tells you it can't be done. He walked over to an equipment table that had been set up nearby. On it lay a single rifle, a customized M24 sniper weapon system that looked like it had seen serious action. The stock was worn smooth from countless hours of use, and there were small modifications that spoke of a marksman who knew his weapon intimately. "This rifle," Harrison said, picking up the weapon with the reverence of a man holding something sacred, "has been with me for 15 years. Through 12 major operations across 4 different war zones. It's saved more lives than I can count, and it's taken more than I care to remember." He worked the bolt with practiced ease, the mechanical sound sharp and decisive in the morning air. "But here's what you need to understand, gentlemen. This rifle didn't make those shots in Syria. I did. And I didn't make them because I'm superhuman or because I have some magical ability." Harrison's voice grew serious, taking on the tone of a teacher sharing the most important lesson of his career. "I made them because when the moment came, when 37 innocent lives hung in the balance, I stopped thinking like a human being with human limitations. I stopped worrying about what was possible and what wasn't. I became something else entirely." The SEALs watched in fascination as Harrison began to field strip the rifle, his hands moving with unconscious precision. "For those 1.8 seconds, I wasn't Marcus Harrison. I wasn't a SEAL. I wasn't even really human. I was simply the weapon that those 37 people needed me to be." The story began 3 years earlier in the dusty streets of Damascus, Syria. Admiral Harrison, then still a captain, was leading a joint task force mission to extract a group of American journalists who had been taken hostage by a radical terrorist cell. The journalists had been investigating reports of chemical weapons when they were captured during a routine interview that turned into an ambush. Intelligence suggested they were being held in a compound on the outskirts of the city, but the situation was complicated by the presence of civilians in the area. Harrison's team consisted of 8 of the most experienced operators in the Navy's inventory. They had worked together for years, moving through hostile territory like a single organism. Each man knew exactly what the others would do in any given situation. The extraction point was supposed to be clean, Harrison told the assembled SEALs, his hands still working methodically on his rifle. "Our intelligence said the compound was isolated, with clear fields of fire and multiple exit routes. But intelligence, as every operator knows, is often wrong." When Harrison's team arrived at their overwatch position on a ridge overlooking the target compound, they discovered something that changed everything. The terrorists had moved the journalists. Instead of being held in an isolated building, they were now on a city bus, surrounded by local civilians who had no idea they were being used as human shields. 37 innocent people, Harrison continued, his voice tight with remembered tension. Men, women, children, some probably just trying to get to work or visit family, and scattered among them are 4 American journalists. The bus was stopped at what appeared to be a routine checkpoint, but Harrison's trained eye immediately spotted the truth. 6 men in civilian clothes had positioned themselves around the vehicle. Each carried concealed weapons and their body language screamed hostile intent. "My spotter, Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, confirmed what I already knew," Harrison said. "These weren't checkpoint guards. They were the extraction team. They were getting ready to move our people, and they weren't planning on leaving any witnesses." Through his scope, Harrison could see the tension on the bus. The journalists were trying to stay calm, but fear was written across their faces. The civilians sensed something was wrong but didn't understand the danger they were in. Rodriguez started calling out positions, Harrison continued. Target 1, northeast corner of the bus, AK-47 concealed under a jacket. Target 2, driver's side, pistol in his waistband. Target 3, rear of the vehicle. What looked like an improvised explosive device. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The team had planned for a building assault, not a precision rescue operation in the middle of a crowded street. Their rules of engagement were crystal clear. No civilian casualties, no matter what. Target 4 was the problem, Harrison said, his voice growing quieter. He was standing right next to the bus door, close enough to touch the windows. Any missed shot, any ricochet, and innocent people would die. Lieutenant Davidson found himself holding his breath. He had been in similar situations where the margin for error was so small that it might as well not exist. But 6 targets simultaneously, it was beyond anything he had ever faced. Targets 5 and 6 were positioned to create a crossfire, Harrison continued. If shooting started, they would have clear fields of fire into the bus from 2 different angles. Maximum casualties in minimum time. Through his earpiece, Harrison could hear his team leader calling for options. They could wait and try to follow the bus to a more isolated location, but there was no guarantee they would get another chance. They could attempt a ground assault, but the likelihood of civilian casualties was unacceptable. And then Rodriguez said something that changed everything, Harrison recalled. "Sir, they're getting nervous. Whatever they're planning to do, they're going to do it soon." Harrison had been watching the terrorists' body language through his scope. Rodriguez was right. The men were becoming agitated, checking their watches, looking around nervously. Something had spooked them, and they were preparing to cut their losses. "I could see Target 1 reaching for his radio," Harrison said. "I knew that once he made that call, those people on the bus had maybe 30 seconds to live." The distance was significant, nearly 600 yards from Harrison's position to the bus. At that range, even the smallest error in calculation could mean the difference between a clean kill and a catastrophic miss. Wind speed, humidity, the slight vibration from traffic on a nearby road, all of it had to be factored in instantly. "I made the call," Harrison said simply. "Single shooter, simultaneous engagement, all 6 targets." The other SEALs looked at each other in disbelief. The tactical manual doesn't have a chapter on engaging 6 targets simultaneously. It's not taught because it's not possible. My team leader asked if I was certain, Harrison continued. I told him I was. But honestly, gentlemen, I wasn't certain of anything except that if I didn't try, 37 people were going to die. Harrison finished reassembling his rifle and looked up at the assembled men. That's when everything changed. That's when I stopped being Marcus Harrison and became something else entirely. He stood up, cradling the weapon with familiar ease. "You see, there's a place your mind can go when the stakes are absolute. When failure isn't just unacceptable, it's unthinkable. It's a place where time moves differently, where your body responds faster than thought, where the impossible becomes inevitable." The SEALs were riveted. This wasn't just a war story. This was a master class in mental preparation from a man who had achieved the impossible. "I centered myself behind the rifle," Harrison said, demonstrating the position. "I controlled my breathing, slowed my heart rate, and entered what we call the zone. But this was deeper than anything I had ever experienced before." He paused, looking out across the training ground as if he could see that Syrian street again. In that moment, I could see all 6 targets simultaneously, not just in sequence, simultaneously. I could calculate the exact trajectory needed for each shot, the precise timing required to engage them all before any could react. Harrison's voice took on an almost mystical quality. Time slowed down until those 1.8 seconds felt like minutes. My rifle became an extension of my body. My body became an extension of my will. And my will was absolute. Those people were not going to die. Admiral Harrison walked to the center of the training ground, his rifle held at the ready. Around him, 6 targets had been positioned at various angles and distances, recreating the exact scenario he had faced in Syria 3 years earlier. "Let me show you what happened next," he said quietly. The SEALs gathered closer, their earlier skepticism replaced by intense curiosity. They had all heard impossible stories before, but there was something in Harrison's demeanor that suggested this was different. This was real. In that moment, Harrison continued, settling into his shooting stance, everything I had ever learned came together. 28 years of training, thousands of rounds fired, hundreds of missions completed. But more than that, the lives of 37 innocent people created a focus I had never experienced before. He raised the rifle to his shoulder with fluid precision. The first shot was the easiest, paradoxically. Target 1, the man with the radio. He was the immediate threat, the one who would signal the massacre to begin. Through the scope, Harrison had seen the terrorist's finger moving toward the radio button. In the hyper-focused state he had entered, Harrison could almost predict the man's movement before it happened. "But here's what you need to understand," Harrison said, his eye finding the scope. "I didn't shoot target 1 first and then think about target 2. I was already calculating all 6 shots before I pulled the trigger on the first one." The watching SEALs exchanged glances. This was beyond anything they had been taught about target engagement. The human brain simply wasn't wired to process that much information simultaneously. "The math was simple," Harrison continued. 6 targets, maximum 1.8 seconds, 1 rifle. That meant I had roughly 0.3 seconds per target, including the time needed to acquire each new target and adjust my aim. Lieutenant Davidson did the calculation in his head and felt his heart sink. Even the most experienced snipers needed at least a full second to properly acquire and engage a single target. What Harrison was describing was 3 times faster than humanly possible. "Target 1, Harrison said, and his rifle barked once. 600 yards away, a playing card attached to a wooden post exploded into fragments. Time elapsed, 0.28 seconds. The SEALs stared in amazement. Harrison's rifle was already moving, tracking smoothly to the second target position. Target 2 was positioned behind partial cover, Harrison explained, his voice remaining calm even as he demonstrated movements that seemed to defy physics. I had to account for the angle, the reduced target profile, and the fact that a miss here would ricochet directly into the bus. The rifle fired again. Another card disintegrated. Time elapsed, 0.61 seconds. 2 down, 4 to go. The rifle was already tracking to the third position before the sound of the second shot had faded. Target 3 had the explosive device, Harrison said. This shot was critical. If I only wounded him, he might still be able to trigger the bomb. It had to be an instant kill shot, center mass, maximum stopping power. The third shot rang out. Time elapsed, 0.94 seconds. The assembled SEALs were watching something that shouldn't have been possible. Harrison's movements were so fluid they seemed choreographed, as if he had practiced this exact sequence thousands of times. But they all knew he was recreating something that had happened only once, under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Targets 4, 5, and 6 were the real challenge, Harrison continued, his rifle tracking smoothly between the remaining positions. They were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. If any one of them survived, they could still kill everyone on that bus. The fourth shot came even faster than the others. Time elapsed, 1:19 seconds. Now only 2 targets remained, and Harrison had less than 0.6 seconds to engage both of them. The watching SEALs held their breath. This was the moment where the impossible would either be proven or disproven. Target 5, Harrison said, and the rifle fired. Time elapsed, 1.46 seconds. 1 target left. 34 seconds remaining. The rifle was already moving, tracking to the final position with mechanical precision. Target 6, Harrison whispered. The final shot cracked across the training ground. The last card exploded into pieces. Time elapsed, 178 seconds. Silence fell over the training ground like a blanket. 30 of the Navy's most elite snipers stood in stunned amazement, trying to process what they had just witnessed. 6 targets, Harrison said, lowering his rifle. 178 seconds, all neutralized before any could return fire or trigger their weapons. Lieutenant Davidson found his voice first.
Sir, that's
not possible. I mean, I saw you do it, but the human body can't move that fast while maintaining accuracy. Harrison smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. You're absolutely right, Lieutenant. The human body can't do what you just saw. The SEALs looked confused. Had they been watching some kind of demonstration with modified equipment? Special ammunition? Pre-programmed targets? What you witnessed, Harrison continued, wasn't the result of normal human capability. It was the result of what happens when training, determination, and absolute necessity combine to push a person beyond their perceived limitations. He walked among the men, making eye contact with each one. Every one of you has experienced moments in combat when time seemed to slow down, when your reflexes were faster than thought, when you performed beyond what you believed possible. Nods of recognition appeared throughout the group. They all knew the feeling, those moments of crystal clarity when training took over and the impossible became routine. What happened in Syria was that feeling magnified beyond anything I had ever experienced, Harrison explained. The stakes were so high, the necessity so absolute, that my body and mind found a way to do what needed to be done. But sir, another SEAL spoke up, even accounting for combat adrenaline and enhanced reflexes, what you just demonstrated seems to violate the laws of physics. Harrison nodded approvingly. Excellent question, Petty Officer Martinez. And you're right to be skeptical. What I'm about to tell you next will challenge everything you think you know about the limits of human performance. He paused, looking out over the training ground where the 6 destroyed targets stood as evidence of what they had all just witnessed. Because what happened in those 1.78 seconds wasn't just about shooting. It was about entering a state of consciousness that most people never experience. A state where the boundaries between thought and action, between intention and result, completely disappear. Admiral Harrison set his rifle down carefully and turned to face the group of SEALs. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the training ground, but the intensity of the moment remained unchanged. "What I'm about to share with you," he began, "isn't in any manual. It isn't taught at any school. It's something I discovered in that moment in Syria, when the alternative was watching 37 innocent people die." The SEALs leaned in, their earlier amazement giving way to a deeper fascination. They were warriors, and they recognized that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple marksmanship demonstration. "The human nervous system," Harrison continued, "is capable of processing information and coordinating movement far beyond what we normally experience. But accessing that capability requires a level of mental discipline that most people never develop." He began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "In Syria, when I looked through that scope and saw 6 targets that all needed to die simultaneously, my conscious mind tried to tell me it was impossible. But something deeper, something that had been forged by decades of training and refined by countless life-or-death situations, rejected that limitation." Lieutenant Davidson raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, are you talking about some kind of meditation technique?" "Mental preparation?" Harrison smiled. "In a way, yes. But this goes far beyond anything you've learned about combat breathing or mental visualization. This is about fundamentally changing your relationship with time itself." The SEALs exchanged glances. They had all been trained in various mental preparation techniques, but Harrison was describing something that sounded almost mystical. "Time," Harrison said, "is not as fixed as we believe it to be. In moments of extreme stress or perfect focus, the brain can process information and coordinate responses at speeds that seem to violate normal perception." He pointed to his rifle. "When I fired those 6 shots, I wasn't thinking about each target sequentially. I was experiencing them all simultaneously. My mind had mapped out the entire engagement before I pulled the trigger on the first shot." Petty Officer Rodriguez, a veteran of multiple combat deployments, spoke up. "Sir, I've experienced something similar during firefights. Moments where everything seemed to slow down and I could see exactly what needed to happen." "Exactly," Harrison nodded. "Every combat veteran has touched this state, but most of us only access it briefly, and rarely to its full potential. What happened in Syria was different. I didn't just touch this state, I dove into it completely." Harrison walked over to a nearby table where several items had been arranged. A stopwatch, a metronome, and what appeared to be a meditation bell. "The key," he said, picking up the metronome, "is understanding that consciousness operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Your surface awareness, the part that thinks in words and makes deliberate decisions, is actually quite slow." He set the metronome to a steady beat. "This represents normal conscious thought, deliberate, sequential, limited by the speed at which your brain can process language and form coherent ideas." The steady tick-tick-tick filled the air. "But underneath that," Harrison continued, "is another level of awareness. This is where your reflexes operate, where muscle memory resides, where split-second combat decisions are made without conscious thought." He picked up the meditation bell and struck it once. The sound was pure and immediate, cutting through the mechanical rhythm of the metronome. "In Syria, I learned to bypass the metronome entirely and operate purely from the bell level. No sequential thinking, no verbal processing, no conscious decision-making. Pure instantaneous response." The SEALs were listening intently now. This wasn't just about shooting. This was about accessing human potential they had never imagined existed. "The technique," Harrison said, "begins with accepting that everything you've been taught about human limitations might be wrong. Not completely wrong, but incomplete." He demonstrated a simple exercise. "Close your eyes. All of you, right now." 30 SEALs closed their eyes simultaneously. "Without opening your eyes," Harrison continued, "I want you to point to every person standing around you. Don't think about it. Don't try to remember where they were standing. Just point, arms extended throughout the group, fingers pointing in various directions. Now open your eyes and see how accurate you were." The results were startling. Despite not consciously memorizing anyone's position, the vast majority of the SEALs had pointed with remarkable accuracy. Their subconscious awareness had been tracking spatial relationships even when their conscious minds were focused elsewhere. "This is what I'm talking about," Harrison said. "Your mind is constantly processing far more information than your conscious awareness realizes. The challenge is learning to trust that deeper level of processing." Lieutenant Davidson looked troubled. "But sir, even if we can access enhanced awareness, there are still physical limitations. Muscles can only move so fast, rifles can only cycle so quickly." Harrison nodded approvingly. "Another excellent question. And you're absolutely right about physical limitations. But what if I told you that most of those limitations are self-imposed?" He picked up his rifle again. "This weapon can cycle much faster than I demonstrated earlier. The limiting factor isn't the mechanical action. It's the shooter's belief about how fast he can accurately acquire and engage targets." To demonstrate, Harrison began dry firing the rifle, working the bolt with smooth, rapid motions. The mechanical sounds came so quickly they almost blurred together. "Physical preparation is crucial," he said, "but mental preparation is what determines how close you can come to your physical maximum. And most people operate at maybe 30% of their actual potential." Petty Officer Martinez raised his hand. "Sir, how do we develop this ability? Is it something that can be trained?" "That," Harrison said with a slight smile, "is the most important question you could ask. Because yes, it can be trained, but the training isn't what you might expect." He set the rifle down and faced the group squarely. "The training begins with changing your relationship with failure. Most people are so afraid of missing, of making mistakes, of looking foolish, that they never push themselves to discover what they're truly capable of." The SEALs nodded. They all knew the feeling of holding back, of playing it safe, of operating within comfortable limits. "In Syria," Harrison continued, "failure wasn't an option, not because I was afraid of the consequences to my career or reputation, but because 37 innocent people would die if I failed. That level of necessity changes everything." He paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. "The second part of the training," he said, "is learning to operate without your internal narrator. You know what I mean. That voice in your head that constantly comments on what you're doing, questions your decisions, worries about outcomes." Every SEAL in the group knew exactly what he meant. The internal dialogue that could either help or hinder performance depending on the situation. "When I fired those 6 shots," Harrison said, "there was no voice in my head. No thoughts about wind speed or bullet drop or target prioritization. There was only perfect, instantaneous response to what needed to happen." The group stood in rapt attention, understanding that they were receiving instruction that could fundamentally change how they approached their profession. "Tomorrow," Harrison said, "we begin your real training." The next morning arrived gray and overcast, with a light mist rolling in from the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Harrison stood in the same position as the day before, but the training ground had been transformed overnight. Instead of simple stationary targets, a complex maze of obstacles, moving platforms, and electronic sensors had been constructed. The 30 SEALs assembled in formation, their faces showing a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. They had spent the night discussing what they had witnessed, trying to make sense of the impossible demonstration and the philosophy behind it. "Yesterday," Harrison began, "you saw what's possible when human limitations are transcended. Today you begin learning how to transcend your own." Lieutenant Davidson studied the elaborate setup around them. "Sir, what exactly are we looking at here?" Harrison smiled. "This, gentlemen, is what I call the Conscious Evolution Training Protocol. Everything you see has been designed to push you beyond your comfort zone and force you to access deeper levels of awareness." He walked toward a series of platforms that moved in seemingly random patterns, each one supporting a different type of target. Some were stationary, others rotated, and a few moved in complex 3-dimensional arcs. "The traditional approach to marksmanship training," Harrison explained, "focuses on perfecting technique under controlled conditions. You learn to shoot from stable positions at known distances with predictable environmental factors." The SEALs nodded. This was exactly how they had all learned to shoot, starting with simple, controlled scenarios and gradually adding complexity. "But real combat," Harrison continued, "is never controlled. Real combat is chaos, confusion, and split-second decisions made with incomplete information. So why do we train in controlled environments and expect to perform in chaotic ones? He gestured toward the training course. This setup eliminates control entirely. You don't know which targets will appear when. You don't know what obstacles you'll face. You can't plan your shots in advance because the situation is constantly changing. Petty Officer Martinez looked skeptical. Sir, how can we develop accuracy if we can't predict the targets? That's exactly the point, Harrison replied. Accuracy based on prediction and planning is limited accuracy. True accuracy comes from instantaneous response to what is, not what you expect to be. He picked up his rifle and walked to the starting position. Let me demonstrate. But first I need you to understand something crucial about what you're about to see. Harrison's demeanor grew more serious. What I'm about to show you isn't a trick or a special technique. It's what becomes possible when you completely surrender control and trust in capabilities you didn't know you possessed. Without warning, a series of electronic beeps began sounding from various positions around the course. Targets began appearing and disappearing at irregular intervals. Some popped up for mere fractions of a second. Others remained visible longer but moved in unpredictable patterns. Harrison raised his rifle and entered the maze of obstacles. What happened next was like watching a master artist at work. Harrison moved through the course with fluid precision, his rifle speaking at irregular intervals as targets appeared and disappeared. But unlike a traditional shooting demonstration, there was no pause between shots, no careful aiming, no deliberate target acquisition. Instead, Harrison seemed to flow through the course like water finding its path down a hillside. His rifle would snap to targets that the watching SEALs barely had time to see, firing at angles and in positions that should have been impossible to achieve accurately. Target left. Elevation 12 degrees, one of the SEALs called out, trying to track Harrison's progress, but by the time the words were spoken, Harrison had already engaged that target and moved on to 3 others. He was operating at a speed that made conventional target calling impossible. The course continued for nearly 2 minutes, an eternity in combat time. When the electronic beeps finally stopped and the last targets disappeared, Harrison lowered his rifle and walked back to the group. 97 targets, he announced calmly. 97 hits, 0 misses. The SEALs stared in stunned silence. They had all been watching, but the speed and complexity of what they had witnessed was almost impossible to process. Sir, Lieutenant Davidson said slowly, how many targets did you see before you started shooting? None, Harrison replied simply. None? I didn't scout the course. I didn't study the target patterns. I had no idea what I would encounter when I started moving. The implications of this statement hung in the air like smoke. Harrison had just achieved perfect accuracy against nearly 100 targets without any advanced knowledge or preparation. Then how? Davidson began. I stopped trying to control the outcome, Harrison interrupted. I stopped thinking about what I needed to do and simply allowed my body to do what it had been trained to do. He set his rifle down and faced the group. This is the heart of what I'm trying to teach you. Your conscious mind, the part that thinks and plans and worries, is not your best asset in combat. It's actually your primary limitation. Petty Officer Rodriguez raised his hand. But, sir, without conscious thought, how do we make tactical decisions? How do we prioritize targets or assess threats? Excellent question, Harrison nodded. And the answer is that there's another level of intelligence operating within you. One that's faster, more accurate, and more comprehensive than your thinking mind. He tapped his temple. Up here you can only process information sequentially. One thought at a time, one decision at a time. But your deeper awareness can process thousands of pieces of information simultaneously. To demonstrate, Harrison had the SEALs perform another exercise. I want you to count backwards from 100 by 7s out loud. All of you at the same time. The cacophony of voices filled the training ground as 30 men began counting. 100, 93, 86. Keep counting, Harrison instructed. But while you're doing that, I want you to also track my movement around the group. Harrison began walking in an irregular pattern among the SEALs, occasionally stopping behind someone, sometimes moving quickly, other times slowly. After several minutes, he called for them to stop. Now, still without stopping your counting, tell me every position where I stopped for more than 5 seconds. Despite the fact that their conscious minds had been occupied with mathematical calculations, nearly every SEAL was able to accurately describe Harrison's movement pattern. Your deeper awareness, Harrison explained, was tracking my position even while your conscious mind was busy with arithmetic. This is the level of consciousness I'm trying to help you access. The morning mist had begun to clear, and shafts of sunlight broke through the overcast sky, illuminating the complex training course in dramatic patterns of light and shadow. The training protocol, Harrison continued, is designed to overwhelm your conscious mind so completely that you have no choice but to operate from deeper levels of awareness. He gestured toward the course. When targets are appearing faster than you can think about them, when the environment is changing so rapidly that planning becomes impossible, your thinking mind gives up. And that's when your true capabilities emerge. Lieutenant Davidson looked at the complex course with new understanding. So this isn't about learning new techniques. It's about unlearning the limitations we've imposed on ourselves. Precisely, Harrison smiled. Every one of you has already demonstrated superhuman capabilities in combat. You've all had moments where you performed beyond what you thought possible. The difference is that you attributed those moments to luck, adrenaline, or accident. He walked among the men, making eye contact with each one, but they weren't accidents. They were glimpses of what you're truly capable of when you stop limiting yourself with conscious thought. The SEALs began to understand that they weren't just learning advanced marksmanship. They were being introduced to a completely different way of operating as human beings. The first phase of training, Harrison announced, begins now. Each of you will enter the course individually. You will not be given any information about what you'll encounter. You will not be allowed to observe other participants before your turn. He paused, letting the challenge sink in. Your only instruction is this: stop thinking and start responding. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and most importantly, trust capabilities you didn't know you possessed. Petty Officer Martinez was selected to go first. As he approached the starting position, Harrison offered one final piece of advice. Remember, he said quietly, the targets don't care about your doubts or fears. They only respond to your commitment. Be completely committed to each shot, even if you don't understand how you're making it. Martinez nodded, raised his rifle, and stepped into the course. What followed was a revelation for everyone watching, including Martinez himself. Martinez entered the course with the careful, deliberate movements of a trained sniper. He took his time with the first target, carefully acquiring his sight picture, controlling his breathing, squeezing the trigger with textbook precision. It was perfect technique executed flawlessly, and it was completely wrong. By the time Martinez fired his carefully aimed shot, 3 other targets had already appeared and disappeared. The electronic beeps were sounding faster than he could process them consciously, and his methodical approach was leaving him hopelessly behind. Stop thinking, Harrison called out. You're trying to control something that can't be controlled. Martinez lowered his rifle, frustrated. He was one of the Navy's best snipers, with a record that spoke for itself. But this course was making him feel like a beginner. Martinez, Harrison's voice cut through his self-doubt. What's the first thing you see when you raise your rifle? The target, sir. Wrong. The first thing you see is your scope. The first thing you think about is your breathing, your stance, your sight alignment. You're so busy being a perfect sniper that you're forgetting to actually shoot. Harrison jogged over to where Martinez stood. Here's what I want you to do. Forget everything you've ever been taught about marksmanship. Pretend you're not a SEAL, you're not a sniper, you're not even a soldier. Martinez looked confused. Sir, what am I then? You're a weapon, Harrison said simply. A weapon doesn't think about technique. It doesn't worry about perfect form. It simply responds to the need to engage targets. Harrison stepped back. Try again, but this time don't aim at the targets. Let the rifle aim itself. The advice sounded like mystical nonsense, but Martinez had learned to trust Harrison's guidance. He raised his rifle again, but this time he tried to quiet the voice in his head that was constantly analyzing and adjusting. The first target appeared, and instead of carefully acquiring it, Martinez simply pointed the rifle where his eyes were looking and fired. The target disappeared with a satisfying ping. Better, Harrison called out. Keep moving. Don't think about the shot you just made. Don't think about the shot you're about to make. Just respond to what you see. Something clicked for Martinez. He began moving through the course faster, his rifle finding targets with an ease that surprised him. He wasn't consciously aiming anymore. He was simply pointing and shooting wherever his attention was drawn. His accuracy began to improve dramatically. Targets that would have required careful calculation and deliberate aim were falling to quick, instinctive shots. He was operating at a speed he had never imagined possible. 53 targets, Harrison announced when Martinez completed the course. 47 hits. Not perfect, but a vast improvement. Martinez was breathing hard, not from physical exertion, but from the mental intensity of the experience. "Sir, I don't understand what just happened. Some of those shots felt impossible, but I made them anyway." "What happened," Harrison explained, "is that you briefly accessed the same state of consciousness I used in Syria. You stopped being limited by what you thought was possible and started operating from what actually is possible." Lieutenant Davidson was next. Having watched Martinez's transformation, he approached the course with a different mindset. Instead of relying on his technical training, he tried to emulate the fluid, responsive style he had witnessed. Davidson's run was even more impressive. 61 targets, 58 hits. His movements through the course were smoother, more intuitive. He seemed to anticipate where targets would appear before they actually did. "Outstanding," Harrison said when Davidson finished. "You're beginning to understand that accuracy isn't about perfect technique. It's about perfect awareness." One by one, each SEAL took their turn in the course. The results varied, but every participant experienced moments of superhuman performance that challenged their understanding of what was possible. Petty Officer Rodriguez achieved perfect accuracy for nearly 30 consecutive targets before his conscious mind reasserted itself and his performance declined. Chief Watson discovered he could engage multiple targets simultaneously, something he had always believed was impossible. By the end of the day, the 30 SEALs had witnessed something unprecedented, not just Admiral Harrison's impossible demonstration, but their own capabilities expanding beyond anything they had previously imagined. "What you've experienced today," Harrison told the assembled group as the sun began to set, "is just the beginning. You've had glimpses of expanded awareness, moments where you operated beyond normal human limitations." The men listened intently, still processing the day's revelations. "But these were just glimpses," Harrison continued, "brief moments when your conscious limitations were bypassed. The real training involves learning to access this state consistently, reliably whenever it's needed." Lieutenant Davidson raised his hand. "Sir, is it possible to operate at this level during actual combat? When lives are on the line and the stakes are real?" Harrison's expression grew serious. "That's exactly when this level of performance becomes most important. Because when lives truly depend on your actions, when failure is genuinely not an option, your mind will find capabilities you never knew existed." He paused, looking out over the Pacific Ocean where the sun was painting the water in shades of gold and orange. "In Syria, when I saw those 37 innocent people about to die, something inside me rejected the possibility of failure so completely that reality itself seemed to bend around my intention. Time slowed down, my awareness expanded, and my body became capable of movements that physics says should be impossible." The SEALs felt a collective chill as they contemplated the implications of what Harrison was saying. This wasn't just about becoming better soldiers. This was about discovering hidden potentials within human consciousness itself. "Tomorrow," Harrison announced, "we take the next step. Tomorrow you learn to enter this state at will, without waiting for circumstances to force it upon you." As the group dispersed, each man carried with him the knowledge that everything he had believed about human limitations might be wrong. They had seen the impossible demonstrated and, more importantly, they had begun to experience it themselves. The real training was about to begin. 6 months later, Lieutenant Davidson found himself crouched behind a concrete barrier in a war-torn neighborhood of Kandahar, Afghanistan. The mission had gone sideways in the worst possible way. What was supposed to be a simple extraction had turned into a full-scale firefight, with his team pinned down by multiple hostile positions. Through his earpiece, he could hear his team leader's urgent voice. "Davidson, we need those sniper positions neutralized now. The convoy can't move until those rooftops are clear." Davidson peered through his scope and felt his heart sink. 7 enemy snipers had positioned themselves across multiple buildings, each with clear lines of fire on the convoy route. The civilians they were supposed to extract were trapped in a vehicle directly in the kill zone. In the old days, before his training with Admiral Harrison, Davidson would have begun the methodical process of engaging targets one by one. Careful acquisition, controlled breathing, precise shots. It would have taken several minutes, and by then the civilians would likely be dead. But as he studied the tactical situation, Davidson felt something familiar stirring within him. It was the same sensation he had experienced during those impossible training sessions at Coronado. Time seemed to slow down, and his awareness expanded beyond normal perception. "Control, this is Overwatch." Davidson whispered into his radio. "I can see all 7 targets," requesting permission to engage simultaneously. There was a pause on the radio. His team leader's voice came back confused. "Say again, Overwatch. Did you say simultaneously?" "Affirmative," Davidson replied, his voice steady despite the impossibility of what he was proposing. "All 7 targets, single engagement sequence. Time to completion approximately 2 seconds," another pause. "Then, Overwatch, are you certain? We can call in air support if needed." Davidson looked through his scope again, and suddenly he wasn't seeing 7 separate targets anymore. He was seeing one complex engagement, one fluid sequence of movements that would unfold with mathematical precision. Admiral Harrison's voice echoed in his memory. "When failure is not an option, reality bends around your intention." "Negative on air support," Davidson replied. "I've got this." He settled into his firing position and entered the state of consciousness that Harrison had taught him to access. The constant chatter of his internal dialogue ceased. His breathing deepened and slowed. Time stretched like elastic. Through his scope, Davidson could see all 7 targets simultaneously. Not in sequence, but as parts of a single pattern that his enhanced awareness was processing as one entity. He could visualize the precise trajectory needed for each shot, the exact timing required to engage all targets before any could react or relocate. Engaging, he whispered into his radio. What happened next would be talked about in special operations circles for years to come. Davidson's rifle spoke 7 times in 194 seconds, each shot flowing seamlessly into the next with mechanical precision. The muzzle barely had time to rise between shots before it was tracking to the next target. 7 enemy snipers fell silent simultaneously. "Targets neutralized," Davidson reported calmly. "Convoy is clear to move." The radio crackled with amazed voices from his team members. "Overwatch, confirm count. Did you just engage 7 targets?" "Affirmative." Time elapsed. Davidson checked his watch, though he had felt every fraction of a second during the engagement. Under 2 seconds. Later, when the mission was complete and the civilians were safe, Davidson's team leader pulled him aside. Captain Reynolds had been a SEAL for 15 years and had seen every kind of combat situation imaginable. "Davidson," Reynolds said quietly, "I need you to explain what I just saw, because according to every manual I've ever read, what you did out there is impossible." Davidson thought about how to answer. How do you explain accessing superhuman capabilities to someone who hasn't experienced it themselves? "6 months ago," Davidson began, "I would have agreed with you, but I learned something from Admiral Harrison that changed everything I thought I knew about human limitations." He paused, trying to find the right words. "There's another level of performance available to us, Captain. A level where the normal rules don't apply, but it only becomes accessible when the stakes are absolute." Reynolds looked skeptical. "Are you telling me this is some kind of mental training technique?" "More than that," Davidson replied. "It's about discovering that most of our limitations are self-imposed. When you truly commit to an outcome, when failure becomes genuinely unthinkable, your body and mind find capabilities you never knew existed." Over the following months, word of Davidson's impossible shot spread through the special operations community. Other members of Harrison's original training group began reporting similar experiences, moments of superhuman performance when the stakes demanded it. "Chief, Watson engaged 12 targets in under 3 seconds during a hostage rescue in Iraq. Petty Officer Rodriguez achieved perfect accuracy against 15 moving targets while under heavy fire in Somalia." One by one, Harrison students were discovering that the impossible demonstrations they had witnessed at Coronado were not unique to their instructor. Admiral Harrison, now retired from active duty, but still involved in advanced training programs, received regular reports of these extraordinary performances. Each account confirmed what he had always known, that human potential extended far beyond what most people believed possible. During a quiet evening at his home overlooking the Pacific, Harrison received a call from Lieutenant Davidson. "Sir, Davidson's voice was filled with emotion. "I wanted to thank you for showing us what we were truly capable of." "You don't need to thank me," Harrison replied. "You already possessed those capabilities. I just helped you recognize them." "But sir, how did you know? How did you know we could perform at that level?" Harrison was quiet for a moment, watching the sun set over the ocean where he had spent so many years serving his country. "Because 37 years ago," he said finally, "I was a young SEAL who believed human limitations were absolute. Until the day I met a master sergeant who showed me otherwise." Davidson understood. The tradition was continuing, passed from one generation of warriors to the next. The knowledge that human potential was far greater than anyone imagined, waiting to be unlocked when circumstances demanded it. "The real secret," Harrison continued, "isn't the techniques or the training protocols. It's the understanding that when lives depend on your actions, when failure truly is not an option, you become capable of things that seem impossible." He paused, remembering that day in Syria when time had slowed and reality had bent around his absolute determination to save innocent lives. "And sometimes," Harrison added softly, "impossible is exactly what the situation requires." Years later, when Davidson became an instructor himself, he would pass on the same lesson to a new generation of warriors. The cycle would continue, each group of students discovering that the limits they had accepted were not limits at all, but merely boundaries waiting to be transcended. In a world where heroes are often measured by their willingness to accept impossible odds, Harrison's legacy lived on in the knowledge that sometimes impossibility itself could be overcome through absolute commitment, perfect training, and the courage to trust in capabilities beyond normal human understanding. The legend of the SEAL Admiral who struck 6 targets in 1.8 seconds became more than just a story. It became proof that when everything is on the line, the human spirit can achieve things that defy explanation, and somewhere in the world when innocent lives hang in the balance, Harrison's students continue to demonstrate that the impossible is simply another word for not yet accomplished.